Tay and Mickey are two of my dearest friends, and it happens that they each represent one of the two primary types of people who fill our prisons. Mickey represents the drug addict, a person who is most often self-medicating an underlying mental illness or emotional trauma. And Tay represents the violent urban youth, typically a low-income ethnic minority, and most often also dealing with underlying emotional trauma. On the surface, Mickey and Tay are almost polar opposites, but they are both prison lifers in that they are serving life sentences and that they both began their journey of incarceration very early, at the age of 11. They also both struggled with the same underlying issues that propelled them into the kind of self-destructive and self-defeating behaviors that land a person in prison. It is my hope that when this presentation is finished, you will see my friends not as men who are threatening and inherently bad or scarred beyond redemption, but as I do, beautiful souls who have gifts to offer the world, men who have survived society's obstacles and prejudices and life's repeated hard blows, with their hearts miraculously still intact. It is my hope that you see them, the world we live in, and our legal and rehabilitation systems differently, and that you are inspired to take action toward positive change, even if only by opening your minds and hearts and changing your perceptions. I didn't set out to work with incarcerated people. I was a licensed mental health counselor who specialized in treating survivors of abuse and trauma. And it's true that the vast majority of incarcerated people are survivors of abuse and trauma, but working with them wasn't in my career plans. But then Mickey came into my life. Mickey and I wrote his memoir together, and in the process became the closest of friends. When Mickey first sent me a photo of him, I cried, partly because of the deep sadness that was broadcasting from his eyes. My friend's 4-year-old saw Mickey's picture, touched his eyes and said, "Mommy, who hurt him?" It turns out that lots of people have hurt Mickey, and what makes him extraordinary is that he's come through all the abuse, mistreatment, and misunderstanding, loving people and life, and seeing only the light and goodness in all of it. An Aryan gang became upset with him when he wouldn't align with the whites and continued to make friends with non-white inmates. They attempted to murder him by slitting his throat and stabbing him several times in the stomach. His response to the murder attempt was this: "I don't know what became of them. I never saw them again, but I've forgiven them." In their actions I heard not a cry for murder, but for love. Love isn't part of their beliefs or their worldview, and they walk around with gaping emotional holes because of it. Holes they protect with every variety of defense and weaponry. I guess I've been enough like them to understand. Mickey was the first incarcerated person or even ex-con that I'd ever known. He looks a little like Gandhi and acts like Gandhi too. He's gentle, kind, and compassionate, the kind of man who notices the beauty of sunrises and puts it into poetry, or can get birds to eat out of his hands. Here is a recording of him reciting a poem that he wrote for me.
"In every rose and sunset does love appear. In tangled moss and cobweb it does adhere. In morning's light her smile's a song. Spirit of faith to her belongs. Unfettered dreams and love that sings of life and things."
If you had to guess what crimes Mickey committed, you'd never think murder or assault with a deadly weapon. Never. Mickey spent 40 of his 58 years in correctional institutions, and if you read our book, I think you'll agree with me that he shouldn't have done any prison time, ever. Drug rehab and counseling, yes, but not incarceration. Mickey died several years ago of cancer. I call his death his great escape because it seemed the only way that he was going to get out of prison. Even though Mickey is no longer with us, I will talk about him in present tense for simplicity's sake. And then there's Tay. Tay recently pointed to a photo taken during our visit and said, "You can tell I'm smiling because my cheeks go up." I got a good laugh out of that. But for most of his life, Tay has intentionally not smiled, or at least not let people see him smile. For self-protection, he developed what he calls an aura of violence. So the facial expression that you and I would identify as a smile is a fairly new configuration for his face muscles, but you can see the warmth in his eyes. Tay is my current co-author. We are co-writing his memoir, and he, like Mickey before him, has become one of my closest friends. It has taken us almost 6 years of knowing each other and 4.5 years of writing on and off to get 3/4 of our book completed. On the surface, Tay has been unmotivated to write, despite the fact that he has said all along that this book is very important to him. Tay doesn't typically have motivational problems. He was at the top of a gang and had a multi-state drug business, so he's got motivation in him. It took me a while to figure out that the delay hasn't really been about lack of motivation. He has needed the years and the slow pace to peel back the layers of self-discovery and get comfortable with each new level of disclosure. Tay is African American and was raised in a violent urban neighborhood. His culture is one of deep privacy. They do not tend to talk about things, especially emotional things. And most of these guys have defense mechanism on top of defense mechanism, armor on top of armor. So really getting to know them can be a painstakingly slow process. And if you're in the role of supporting them or helping them, the process can be even slower. Add to that their defense mechanisms and protective armor can make them unlikable, hard to deal with, and sometimes plain scary. And it's easy to see why people don't often respond to them with compassion, nor do they have the patience to help them unbury themselves from psychological and emotional debris. But for those who stick with these guys and gals, and who keep an optimistic outlook and an open heart, the result can be beautiful and seem almost miraculous. Under all that fight are often the most beautiful souls. Tay is one of them. For the first couple of years of my friendship with Tay, it was a little like a game of peekaboo. He'd show me glimpses of who he is behind the mask and under the armor, then retreat back to his emotional fortress, watching through the crack to see how I reacted to what he had let me see, and God forbid if I reacted wrong. There were times when I misunderstood where he was coming from or questioned his motives, and because I didn't realize what had just happened, that he had given me the gift of trusting me with a piece of himself, and I had been wary or unappreciative of the gift, I then found his reaction to my reaction unreasonable, and then he felt totally misunderstood, which he was, and all hell broke loose. The journey of friendship with Tay has been emotionally messy and painfully slow. But there were times when we got it right, when we were in sync, and he'd show me a glimpse of himself, and I could really see what he was showing me. There is pure gold in my friend, and more he has allowed me to be the beneficiary of those treasures. In the early part of our friendship, Tay was one way in one letter and another way in another letter. He was a kaleidoscope of demeanors, moods, and personalities. Looking back, I think this was because he had recently left his gang, given up street life, and lost most of what had defined him. He was figuring out who he was, and parts of him were re-emerging that had been dormant since early childhood. At times he was hard, barely keeping a leash on his anger and frustrations and wanting to lash out and hurt someone, while at other times he was tolerant and even diplomatic in handling the politics and challenges of prison. At other times he was a bit arrogant, boastful, or self-promoting, and others humble or even insecure, and he almost never held back on admitting what he saw as his shortcomings. Sometimes he was incredibly insightful and self-aware, and other times he was totally clueless and couldn't see in himself what was glaringly obvious to me, and I would bet to others as well. And sometimes he surprised me, like the sympathy card he got me when he found out my father had died. Yep, I got a pink card with rainbow glitter and a baby bunny from a former drug lord and gang leader. And what was written inside was just as surprising. Kim, Mickey told me that your father passed. I'm so sorry to hear that. And if you don't mind, I would like to share something I wrote. They say that that which doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. Chin up, eyes straight forward, and feet moving ahead is the motto for success. But what if you didn't sign up for extra strength training? What if you'd rather catch a break once in a while? Is that so much to ask? At some point, you'd think you'd be entitled to a free pass. Skip this challenge. Avoid that crisis. Delete those problems. It's not that you aren't strong, or that you don't have what it takes to get through this or any of life's obstacles. You are, you do, and you will. But you've built enough character already, and it's time for things to lighten up a bit. And it will. If I were in charge of life's wheel of fortune, you'd get a free spin. I know that your family, friends, and your father, whom I'm sure was your biggest fan, are smiling on you and cheering you on. So, lady, life deals many blows, but continue to get back up and move forward, because there is a whole lot of good waiting for you. I know you've got a whole lot on your plate, but if you find a minute, drop me a line, and may your father rest in peace. Take care, Tay. Ironically, months later I would learn that while Tay had been encouraging me to keep on keeping on and to believe that there was good awaiting me, he himself had been in the midst of a consciously orchestrated slow suicide. He told me that the role of educator had been his favorite role within the gang. At the time he was still occasionally teaching Swahili to fellow inmates, and I could tell from his letters how much he enjoyed teaching me about his world, including basic Swahili words. He was detailed in his descriptions and endlessly patient with my questions and misunderstandings. He loves children. I watch him watching the kids in the visiting room, and it's the closest he ever comes to smiling. And he busts out laughing at their antics. I can see how his endless patience and love of teaching would have made him a fantastic father, and I feel sad that he hasn't been able to father in the traditional sense. While Tay was very candid and open about some things, it was obvious to me that he kept things from me. He omitted details about his life that interested me, and one of my pet peeves was and is that he would almost never answer my questions. It was quickly clear to me that Tay talked about what Tay wanted to talk about and only when he wanted to talk about it. In many letters, he emitted a vibe that was real, pure, and soulful, while in others he would say things like, "Am I less than human because I'd rather work out a conflict with a gun than do it diplomatically?" Or there was the time he justified knocking a guy unconscious for disrespecting him, saying, "At the end of the day, all I've got is my word and my balls." Some letters left me wanting to be his friend, and others did not. I'm embarrassed to admit that even as a former psychotherapist, it took me months to figure out that Tay was grieving. Perhaps a year into our friendship, he told me a story in which he so romanticized gang life that I thought, he talks about the gang like a long-lost love. And then I thought, oh wow, the gang is a lost love for him. He's grieving. I couldn't believe I had missed it. How could a person who had lost his identity, his known way of life, the activities that had previously filled his days, and the friends and bonds that had surrounded him for most of his life not be grieving? That was a humbling moment. He grieved a little differently than most people, but more importantly, he grieved for things that are difficult to understand. Most of us don't understand why someone would grieve a way of life filled with what looks like senseless violence and killing and little substance or purpose. But he was grieving, and deeply, to the point I later found out that he didn't want to live anymore. In the almost 6 years that I've known Tay, I've discovered that Tay's love for those who love him is extraordinarily unconditional. He loves us no matter what, and when I have betrayed his trust or hurt his feelings, he has quickly and constructively let me know about it and then moved on. But probably the trait that I find most endearing is that he loves to cook for people. He has rigged his locker shelf so that it is a grill, and he makes the guys a prison version of a deep dish pizza and all kinds of burritos, and he makes no-bake pies for the guys' birthdays. It's sweet. On the surface, Mickey and Tay are almost polar opposites, but both struggled with the same underlying issues that propelled them into the kind of self-destructive and self-defeating behaviors that land a person in prison. Mickey and Tay are like each other and the majority of incarcerated people, and that they have struggled since early childhood with low self-value. Some of this low self-worth comes from society's stereotypes about and disdain toward people from low-income neighborhoods. Both of them also had the added stigma of having teenage parents, and on top of that, Mickey's father was incarcerated for most of Mickey's childhood. In Tay's case, there were the added stigmas about being black, and particularly a black male. Mickey says, "I could tell, even as a little kid, that people looked down on my family and thought we were trash. But when I was 11, I was caught with marijuana and sent to a Christian school for, quote, wayward boys. And it was the first time someone confirmed what people thought of me and my family. The school was run by cruel people for whom spare the rod and spoil the child was the motto. They had no sympathy for the grief we were suffering over being taken from our families or the emotional issues that led us to misbehave. I tried to run away from the home after 3 months, and when they found me and returned me to the school, the superintendent slapped me several times on the face and told me that I was from a family of parasites and would never amount to anything." I believe that if Mickey had gotten compassion and counseling instead of punishment at that point in time, his life would have taken a different turn. At a time when he needed support, he received more validation that he was without value. As for Tay, he said that as he got older, he went from being perceived as a cute little black boy to a strong, threatening young black man, that every time he was treated with suspicion or disdain, a stick was added to a fire in his belly that started as hurt and grew into rage. Here is a recording of Tay talking about why he got a tattoo on his chest that says "White Girl Killer."
When I was a young teen in juvie, I had a counselor named Hilda Hawkins, a bona fide redneck. Blacks, Latinos, and even some of the white boys called her Hitler Hawkins. Every day this woman would find some reason to ridicule, embarrass, or simply harass me and point out that someone like me could never be anything better than a thug. I hated this woman and the opinion she represented. Because of that, I had this period where if you were a white woman, I hated you as well. And that's why I got the White Girl Killer tattoo. But I also knew that Hilda was the straw that broke the camel's back. By the time I was a young teen, I had already had my fill of wary looks from white women. Looks that said, is he going to do something to me? Or store clerks looking at me like I'm there to steal something. Or a white girl walking across the street to avoid passing me on the sidewalk. We black guys feel the wariness and distrust, the expectations that we're nothing but trouble, and it gets to us. It got to me. White girls represented the opinion of a world that would prefer the poor black boys like me weren't in it. It's hard to feel anything but hatred for that kind of opinion of you. But the truth is that I have never and would never knowingly hurt a woman or a child either. My commitment to that comes from experience.
Tay has examined his motivations for joining and ultimately leading a gang, and decided that much of his motivation was a reaction to the way he felt that the world at large saw him. Through the gang, he felt purposeful and part of something larger than himself. He learned to value and take pride in his culture and cultural history, and he took pride in his contributions to the organization. Within a world that, as Tay says, preferred that poor black boys like him weren't in it, he found importance, purpose, and empowerment. But the variables that factor into low self-worth are numerous. Mickey was skinny and small, only about 5'6", and says he was unathletic, the classic last person picked for the team. He was bookish and passionate about reading, especially Greek mythology and Native American history. In small-town Oklahoma, this made him an odd man out and an object of ridicule. Add to this that he had inherited epilepsy from his mom, and the social deck was definitely stacked against him. As Mickey said, it took only one seizure, with me writhing and spitting on the kindergarten classroom floor, for me to be labeled a freak. Mickey's sister was his only friend. But there was more to Mickey's low self-worth. Mickey's mother struggled with paranoid delusions, and when Mickey was 7, she came at Mickey and his sister with a knife, saying that they were bad and needed to be killed. They escaped into the night, but shortly afterward, Mickey vandalized a pottery store, breaking all the pottery he could get his hands on, until he was caught by the police. He and his sister were put in foster care after that, and according to Mickey's sister, Mickey was emotionally and physically abused in foster care. When Mickey was 11, his mother came at them again with a knife, and this time they escaped to their grandmother's house. Shortly afterward, Mickey ended up doing his first correctional stint for possession of marijuana. Coincidence? At the time that Mickey's sister told me about these incidents with her mother, Mickey and I were almost done writing his memoir, yet he hadn't been able to recall these events. They were that painful for him, which means they were that impactful for him. When he was reminded of them, he said, "Who wants to remember that their own mom thought they were so bad that they had to be killed?" Mickey suffered from extremely low self-worth. I believe that almost everyone in prison does, even and maybe especially the ones who seem full of themselves. And I believe that low self-value is the primary reason that people engage in the self-destructive and self-sabotaging behavior that lands them in prison. As for Tay, until he was 7, his father was a good, involved dad who showed love by teaching Tay how to fish, ride a bike, play ball, and take care of their pet pigeons. According to Tay's mom, his dad prepared Tay breakfast and got him ready for school, while she worked and went to school. According to Tay, he worshipped his father. Then, at age 5, his dad began beating his mom, and at 7, Tay's dad raped him and threatened to cause Tay and his mom real pain if Tay told anyone about it. His dad continued to rape and molest Tay and allowed his friends to molest Tay for about 2 years, until Tay's mom had the courage to leave. Tay says about his dad's rape, "That day, my dad abandoned me as a father. I don't know what I was to him after that, but I wasn't a son. I wasn't someone worth taking care of, loving, and protecting." After over 5 years in friendship with Tay, he admitted that he had never liked himself much, and when I asked what he does like about himself, it took him a couple of minutes to come up with, "I like that I was always curious and eager to learn, but I've lost that eagerness and curiosity lately. I don't know why." It broke my heart that the one thing he could come up with was something he'd felt he'd lost. Low self-value, a belief that one is useless to this world, is a powerful driving factor in misbehavior and other self-destructive behavior. The tragedy is that instead of helping those who misbehave to learn to love and value themselves, we punish them, stigmatize them as bad guys, and place them in environments that reinforce their lack of self-worth. Another element that Tay and Mickey share with each other, as well as the majority of men in prison, is post-traumatic stress disorder. Both endured major emotional trauma, Tay being raped by his father and Mickey's mom attempting to kill him twice, and they endured other traumas that compounded their very personal ones. Tay grew up in a neighborhood that had more homicides per capita than Chicago, and he witnessed shootings and other violence, some that were especially traumatizing, like the shooting of his childhood friend as they walked home from school, and the near-lethal shooting of his beloved Aunt Gina as they walked through a shopping mall parking lot. Mickey, who was born with the trauma of being addicted to heroin, endured the additional trauma of a mom who was psychologically unstable and volatile, even when not threatening his life, and of seeing her strung out on heroin. He also suffered the trauma of a mom who wasn't always able to provide him with food or care for him. Mickey's first real crime was at the age of 16, when he robbed a pharmacy with a fake gun in order to get drugs for himself and his parents. His father had been in the getaway car, and he'd had Mickey do the robbery because he assumed that if Mickey got caught, Mickey would do little to no correctional time. That didn't turn out to be the case. Mickey was sentenced to 7 years in an adult prison. Again, had he gotten help, this time drug rehab, instead of punishment, I know his life would have been different. As it was, one of the biggest prison riots in U.S. history broke out 2 days after Mickey arrived at the prison. The trauma of seeing people beaten and killed, and the anxiety for his safety, caused him to have a psychotic break so deep that he killed a fellow inmate whom he believed was plotting to kill him. After Mickey attempted to kill the man, he attempted to kill himself too. None of that would have happened had Mickey gotten help with his addiction and mental illness instead of punishment. Here's what Mickey said about his time post-murder, when they had him in solitary in the cell where men spent the last night before they were put in the electric chair. I stopped eating and lost 30 pounds. A side note here is that he had already been very thin. I attempted suicide twice, cut my arms and wrists, but they sewed them back together and returned me to my cell. The cell told me that I would never leave and that my life was effectively over. The time came when nothing except death had meaning. I was deeply bedeviled and completely broken. I had no concept of who I was or my place in the world, and there was no foundation on which to rebuild. The complete absence of hope or love or even the comfort of a human touch left gaping holes in my psyche. I was all cracks and holes and rubble. I was broken open. God seeped in. I welcomed him. The symptoms of PTSD provide enormous hurdles to a child's psychological and social development. And unlike the sudden onset PTSD of, say, a war veteran, the symptom of a child's PTSD, because they begin so early, tend to be woven into their personalities and viewed by others and themselves as not symptoms at all, but who he is, which then further affects his self-worth. The symptoms of PTSD tend to have a ripple effect. For example, at 14, Tay found that being on the trigger side of a gun helped quell his anxiety and took him from victim to victor when it came to perpetrators. He said that once he'd had that feeling, he made sure that he never again felt the vulnerability of being without a gun. It wasn't long until he gained the reputation as a shooter. This is a common trajectory in violent neighborhoods. Add to this the fact that most kids with PTSD disassociate from their emotions and describe themselves as feeling dead inside or numb. For many, the cathartic emotional rush of violence and being victorious in situations that mimic their original traumas can be the only time that they feel alive or feel much of anything at all, which further enhances their dependency upon and love affair with violence and weaponry. The irony, however, of finding a balm for their anxiety and violence and guns is that the use of both exponentially increase their chances of coming to harm or even death. But within this is yet another irony, because for many, engaging in violence is a subconscious or even conscious means of suicide, a way to go out in a way that they see as a blaze of glory and avoid what they see as a hopeless future. What's more, the symptoms of PTSD, such as hyperactivity, distractedness, emotional withdrawal or volatility, lack of social connectivity, physically acting out, and extreme lack of trust, make it difficult for caregivers, be they parents, teachers, or even social workers, to like or feel sympathy for their children who are suffering from PTSD. Children with PTSD are challenging and can be disruptive. They often get punished or treated punitively instead of being given love and care. And their punishments can create further trauma, like the trauma of being taken from one's family and put in foster care or in a correctional setting where they suffer the stigma that they are bad people, are exposed to violence, and subjected to even greater punitiveness. For example, in juvie, Tay once refused to do a therapy in which he was supposed to pretend that he was howling at the moon, and he was given 3 days of isolation. Tay's times in juvenile prisons were such triggers for his emotional trauma that he tried to kill himself multiple times, starting just a few weeks into his first sentence at the age of 11. Mickey was so traumatized that he ran away multiple times, risking being out on the open road almost 50 miles from his home, and the beating he knew he'd get if he were caught. He took these risks to get back to his mother, whom he worried about and missed desperately. Both responded to the trauma of their correctional punishment by further withdrawing into themselves, trusting the world less and hating it more. Another commonality that Mickey and Tay share with each other and the majority of people in prison was the lack of a healthy outlet for their emotional pain. Someone to talk to who responded in a productive way, or permission to feel what they were feeling. Both stuffed their grief, pain, and fear, numbed it, and channeled it into destructive behavior. Tay numbed his pain and anxiety with marijuana, which he began using at age 9. He was a chronic user by 11. Tay says,
"My father told me that if I told my mother or anyone about what he was doing to me, he would show me and my mom what real pain was. I didn't take that as an idle threat, but even if my father hadn't threatened me, I still wouldn't have told anyone. In the streets, we were taught that to expose yourself as having been a victim of any circumstance was to expose a weakness that others would take advantage of. We never got the chance to take care of the pain that came with our trauma. Most of us got creative, trying to hide that part of our lives. I know I did. I viewed everyone as my enemy and wouldn't allow anyone to get close to me. We all have our defense mechanisms, and mine was always violence or keeping the aura of violence around me. I understood that by pushing people away, I was not giving myself the opportunity to get to the core of what was going on with me. But I didn't feel like I had a choice. I held it all in and let it fester into something monstrous. I had a lot of emotions bottled up, but anger was the only emotion that was acceptable for a boy in my neighborhood. So I channeled all of it, grief, sadness, pain, and hopelessness, into anger. By the age of 12 or 13, I felt the hatred for the world so fierce and violent that it hurt to look into another person's eyes. I began acting out and was so totally lost and unyielding to my mother and everyone else that all they could do was pray for my soul.
But it doesn't take this kind of pain to set a kid on the path of destruction. Growing up poor, surrounded by people who feel hopeless, who lack belief in themselves, who work hard for little, who battle with depression and addiction, and underneath it all, very low self-worth. Growing up in a community where violence is commonplace, where brutality is just what is. These things can take a serious toll on a kid, especially when he feels like there's no safe place to talk about it or doesn't know how to talk about it. As for Mickey, the cruelty that Mickey experienced exacerbated his inherited disposition toward paranoia. He isolated himself socially to the point of being a recluse and numbed himself with drugs starting at the age of 11. He was an opioid addict by the age of 14 and at 15 began criminal activity to support his habit and the habit of his parents. One of Tay's primary PTSD symptoms is anxiety about his own welfare and the welfare of others. He won't rest easy until he knows that someone has made it safely home. He's prone to freak out with worry if someone isn't able to answer his calls, and as much as he treasures visits, he asks that people not drive out to visit him if it's raining. The added dangers and violence of correctional institutions and his lack of control to escape them was so traumatic for him that the only way he could see to escape them was through death. Additionally, his lack of ability to oversee how his mom and other loved ones were doing in their day-to-day lives took a heavy emotional toll on him. In Black and other minority communities, the policy is normally what goes on in my house stays in my house. They're afraid of being judged. They don't want people to know that someone in their family is struggling with emotional issues or dealing with a trauma because they think people will label them as crazy. Everyone is so worried about what the next person thinks about them that they refuse to get help. This was said by Elizabeth Gerald, whose teenage daughter died by suicide after being traumatized by rape. And Dr. Kimya Dennis says, contrary to popular belief, African Americans are extremely traditional and place heavy emphasis on morality and religion. Generally speaking, African Americans tend to attribute emotional trauma as resulting from a lack of faith or as a side effect of an unrighteous life, and therefore something that can be ignored or fixed through meditation rather than medication, prayer, or some equivalent. This attempt at self-healing can also span into substance abuse, overeating, and violence. She goes on to say that most health experts are not African American or other minorities, and as a result, it can be difficult to seek professional help when the health experts are not familiar with one's culture or don't have training in addressing cultural variations. She says many health experts can then be unintentionally patronizing and condescending, creating obstacles to minorities when they attempt to get help for their emotional and psychological issues. And in poor, small-town communities like Mickey's, being perceived as strong is just as important, and counseling is simply not a normally accepted part of the culture. But even if it were, the availability of free or affordable counseling is limited, particularly with experienced and adept counselors. For both Mickey and Tay, their rehabilitation came not from a rehabilitation system, but through the healing power of love and being treated as someone of value. Look at the difference in Mickey's eyes in these photos. You can see the healing power of love. One was taken when he had no people on the outside, no mail, no visitors. The other was taken after I began visiting him, after people who had read his story had become his pen pals, and after he'd been reunited with the only woman he had ever loved romantically, as well as his sister. As Mickey wrote in our book, the healing power of love began for him during his despair and despondency after he killed a man. He felt God's love seep in, and it began to change him. At that time, he befriended an inmate in charge of cleaning the death chamber where Mickey was then housed. And this inmate got him into yoga and spirituality and connected Mickey to a couple who ran a national prison ashram project founded by Ram Dass. Mickey became pen pals with this couple and was featured prominently in their book, We're All Doing Time, which for the first time in a long time gave Mickey a sense of being useful. But the big healing came when Mickey and I became friends and wrote his story together. He became Uncle Mickey to my kids and an instant part of our family. He mattered to somebody. And he got such kudos for his book that he felt good about himself and his contribution to the world. A high school junior wrote to us saying that she listed Life Sentence, Life Purpose as one of the top 5 books that most impacted her life. Feedback like this made his heart soar, and reuniting with his sister and former love healed those relationships along with his heart. Mickey not only felt loved, but more importantly, had avenues through which to be loving and to be of value. He was a great support for me and those close to him, a wise spiritual counselor, a yogi who lived in a cell. In our 3-year friendship, before Mickey died, I never once saw evidence of paranoia, any psychotic symptoms, or even agitation. Centered in spirit and with channels for love all around him, he no longer needed psychotropic medication. As for Tay, I will let him tell you himself about how love and having someone to see the good in him began his healing and transition into legitimate life. But let me add that I believe that the fact that his wife represented the white majority, whom he believed had stigmatized him, made her positive regard for him all the more significant and healing.
Had I not met my wife Laura, I may never have entertained the idea of leaving the gang and criminal life. Since childhood, everyone had preconceived notions about who I was. Laura didn't come with those stereotypes and patiently let me show her who I am. She helped me see the underlying good in me and the same underlying good in others. I fell in love with her intellect and sheer conky naivete. It was so fresh and appealing to me. I fell for her and I fell hard. I stripped myself of my previous life and everything that came with it to try to make an honest run of this relationship. We are truly the oddest couple on the planet. I've been a legal magnet my entire life, and she has walked on the side of the law for hers. She is 20 years older than me and comes from money. We met 18 years ago and have been married 10 of those years. Apart from my grandmother, she is the nicest and gentlest person I have ever known. We have taught each other a great deal that I don't envision a life without her. But it's very painful at times because I have so little to offer her from my position in prison. I felt the one thing I can offer her was to try to be the best man that I could be, and to do that meant leading a life. What helped me more than anything to move into the straight life was the people who believed in me, who saw the good in me and believed that I could be a positive force in this world. They made me believe it too.